There is currently a lot of talk about a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan, as China still regards the island as an integral part of the country. The question often arises as to what such an occupation would look like. However, it is often overlooked that this has already happened in the past with many other once independent regions. The best-known example of this is probably Tibet, once an independent state, the seat of the Dalai Lama and often referred to as the roof of the world, was invaded and annexed by China. As a result, Tibet lost its full sovereignty, the Dalai Lama had to flee, and today the population there is brutally oppressed. But why was China able to conquer Tibet so easily? Why is the region so incredibly important for the People's Republic, and to what extent can we compare Tibet with the current Taiwan conflict? We take a look at all these fascinating questions in today's video. The conflict between China and Tibet goes back centuries. Tibet has always been influenced by its powerful neighbors, which were once the Mongols and later the Chinese. From the year 1700 in particular, the Chinese wanted to prevent Tibet from falling into the sphere of influence of other powers and sent soldiers and envoys to the court of Lhasa, the capital of Tibet. And this is still the point of contention today. China claims that the envoys were governors of the emperor and justifies its view that Tibet has belonged to China at least since that time. Tibet rejects this, however, as the envoys had no power over political decisions and Tibet was never officially considered a province of the Chinese Empire. Historians are also highly divided on this matter. However, China always used this as an argument that Tibet had always belonged to China and that they therefore had a claim to the territory. However, in the year 1903, the British initially invaded Tibet for a short time. As the Tibetans refused to enter into a trade agreement with the British Empire, they quickly occupied the capital. This naturally angered the Chinese, as they feared that Tibet could now fall out of their sphere of influence, and so they also sent troops to Tibet. The only way to prevent a conflict was for the British and Chinese to agree on a deal. China was to be given sovereignty over Tibet and Tibet was to be forced into a trade agreement with the British in return. In the end, both states had achieved their goals and Tibet now fell completely to China. However, this was only to last for a very short time, as a civil war broke out in China just a few years later, overthrowing the ruling Qing dynasty. For Tibet, this was of course the perfect moment to break away from Beijing again, and the Dalai Lama declared Tibet independent in the year 1903. The Chinese did not recognize this, of course, but their power was so weakened that they could not send soldiers or officials to Tibet. Tibetan independence was also very controversial internationally. An international commission of lawyers investigating the case confirmed that Tibet should be regarded as a de facto independent state. However, most countries were very reluctant to recognize the state, as no one wanted to upset China. The situation was therefore similar to that in Taiwan today. However, the situation for Tibet changed abruptly when the Communist Party seized power in October of the year 1949. Mao founded the People's Republic of China in Beijing, and just 1 year later Chinese soldiers invaded Tibet. The poorly equipped Tibetan army had little to oppose the powerful Chinese People's Liberation Army. All that remained was to appeal to the United Nations for help, but international support failed because of the United Kingdom and the recently independent India. And so the Dalai Lama had to sign the so-called 17-point agreement for the peaceful liberation of Tibet, which officially integrated Tibet into China, but also granted extensive autonomy rights. At first it seemed that Tibet would be allowed to continue to act largely autonomously, but this was followed by a gradual incorporation of China. More and more military forces were stationed in Tibet, and after a brutally suppressed uprising, the Dalai Lama, who feared for his life, was forced to go into exile in India. In the year 1965, the Chinese then also have the Tibetan territory and allocated the other half to Chinese provinces in order to better control the region. And just 1 year later, the darkest period in Tibet's history followed. Mao initiated the so-called Cultural Revolution, which was intended to eradicate elements of traditional cultures, among other things. His Red Guard destroyed almost all monasteries and holy sites, and the heads of Buddha statues were cut off. Even though later Chinese governments distanced themselves from this act of shame and supported reconstruction, it was now clear that Tibet's autonomy was just a fairy tale. To this day, almost all protests and uprisings have been put down by force and, especially since the current President Xi, China has been very keen to maintain control over all areas of life. Tibet is incredibly important for China. Not only strategically, but especially because of its resources. Tibet is the source of many major Asian rivers, including the Yangtze, the Yellow River, the Mekong and the Indus. These rivers supply water to billions of people in Asia, so control of Tibet gives China significant influence over these regions. And the region is rich in minerals such as copper, gold, silver and zinc, which are fundamental to China's industry and economy. It is therefore virtually impossible for Tibet to regain more autonomy. All of the Dalai Lama's peaceful proposals for this have also been rejected by Beijing. We therefore see many parallels to Taiwan in the history of Tibet and, in the event of an occupation, the island would certainly suffer a similar fate in a very short time and freedom and democracy would only be a distant dream. This time, however, the international community seems to be much more vigilant, but we will probably only see how the conflict ends in the coming years or decades.